Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Modernized Risk Management, Innovating and Improving Insurance Compliance. Thank you for spending some time with us today. We're glad you're here. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted. You can answer comments and questions in the chat box. If you'd like to ask our presenter a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions may be addressed during the presentation or during the Q&A session after the presentation. At the close of today's presentation, you'll be asked to complete a very brief questionnaire. Your feedback is very valuable to us here at NASPO, and today's presentation is good for 1 contact hour. To get your certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today. We are honored to have with us Gavin Lacambra, Engagement and Enterprise Risk Management Section Supervisor for the Department of Technology, Management, and Budget with the state of Michigan. Gavin joined Michigan's Central Procurement team in 2014 and played a critical role in policy development and contract compliance. In 2019, he joined the state of Michigan's Enterprise Risk Management team, where he's contributed to the success of major projects such as the restoration of a Detroit landmark, the Cadillac Place building, after a historic 100-year flood event. The multi-billion-dollar infrastructure updates to Interstate 75, the upgrades and enhancements of the Line 5 petroleum pipeline, and most recently, the implementation of the state's first risk management information system. NASPO is excited to have you with us. So now I will turn it over to you, Gavin.
Great. Thank you, Jack. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Our presentation today will highlight the success the state of Michigan has had with its risk management information system, specifically regarding its benefit to the state central procurement office and the efforts taken to proactively manage the risks of contracting with third-party vendors. I'll begin with a brief overview of the role and responsibilities of the state's enterprise risk management team, again, focusing primarily on our role managing the risk exposure involved with third-party contracts. And I'd be remiss if I didn't address the topic of enterprise risk management in general, what it is and how it's different from traditional risk management. Then I'll provide a condensed version of our evolutionary journey from early on, when our role was limited to purchasing insurance on behalf of the state, and through the transformation process that's brought us to where we are today. In doing so, I'll highlight some of the challenges we've encountered along the way and our search for a solution that ultimately led us to implementing a risk management information system. And then I'll wrap things up by providing a glimpse into our future. Before I begin our presentation, I'd like to introduce and give thanks to my team.
Your slides are not advancing.
Oh, I guess looks like my slides aren't advancing on the presentation. Is that the case?
Hi, Gavin. Yeah, it looks like they're not advancing at the moment on my end here. Let's see here.
Me. One second here. I'll try to end this and come right back out. My apologies.
No worries.
How about now?
That works. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as I'm mentioning, I'll begin with a brief overview of the role and responsibilities of the state of Michigan's enterprise risk management team. Again, focusing primarily on our role in managing the risk exposure involved with third-party contracts. And I'd be remiss if I didn't address the topic of enterprise risk management in general, what it is and how it's different from traditional risk management. Then I'll provide a rather condensed version of our evolutionary journey from early on, when our role was limited to purchasing insurance on behalf of the state, and through the transformation process that's brought us to where we are today. In doing so, I'll highlight some of the challenges we've encountered along the way and our search for a solution that ultimately led us to implementing a risk management information system. And then I'll wrap things up by providing a glimpse into our future. But before I begin the presentation, I'd like to introduce and give thanks to my team. I wouldn't be able to accomplish any of the things mentioned throughout this presentation without their hard work and support. My team currently consists of 3 risk management professionals: Megan Bryant, who's responsible for determining the appropriate risk transfer strategy for state contracts; Deidra Rosario, who administers the state's commercial insurance portfolio and manages claims against the state; and Brooke Miner, who's our communications guru and is involved with special projects. Currently, our primary responsibilities include purchasing comprehensive insurance policies on behalf of the state of Michigan. We also administer the state's vehicle self-insurance policy, which involves collaborating with the Michigan Attorney General's office to resolve claims and litigation against the state. And we serve as a resource for all state departments and agencies for risk management and insurance-related matters, including consultation and training services. Lastly, given our exclusive and statutory authority over the insurance terms and requirements that are incorporated into all third-party vendor contracts, we're responsible for assessing the level of risk exposure to the state and drafting contract language to adequately transfer that risk by determining the types and limits of insurance each vendor is required to carry. We then monitor compliance with the insurance terms and communicate with vendors to make sure there's no lapse in coverage. With regard to contractual risk transfer, our role and responsibilities have evolved and expanded over time, as I'll explain in a moment. But first, it's critical to talk about what enterprise risk management is. Enterprise risk management can generally be defined as an integrated and collaborative approach to managing risk across an organization and seizing opportunities to further its objectives. And it's important to highlight here the difference between enterprise risk management and what's referred to as traditional risk management. Traditional risk management treats risks as individual hazards. In other words, identify the risk and mitigate or avoid it. Whereas enterprise risk management really views risk as part of a business strategy, collaborating with all stakeholders, not only to identify and avoid hazardous risks, but in some circumstances, leverage certain risks to benefit from them. The state of Michigan's risk management team has historically taken a traditional risk management approach to the extent that identifying and mitigating risk was very siloed. Each agency or department's risk management strategy sort of operated in a vacuum, and there was little to no information sharing. But within the last decade or so, there's been a significant shift in the risk management industry as a whole that involves a more holistic approach. Large corporations and businesses began adopting a perspective that's more comprehensive and cross-functional. And eventually, the public sector followed suit as state and municipal government entities began to realize the benefits of risk management being an enterprise or an all-hands-on-deck effort. But as I mentioned, the state of Michigan took a very traditional approach to risk management. Our role was pretty much limited to purchasing the necessary commercial insurance policies for the state and obtaining other types of coverage on an as-needed basis. And with regard to the risk transfer process involved with state contracts, historically, buyers were actually responsible for determining the insurance requirements for the contracts they administered. And they were also required to monitor their vendors' compliance with those insurance terms. Now, they were only able to do that because they received very high-level fundamental risk management training by the risk management team. But of course, because buyers aren't insurance experts and really weren't equipped with the necessary risk management skills, Many of our state contracts were either underinsured, thereby increasing the state's risk exposure, or overinsured, unnecessarily costing the state more money. So in an effort to minimize the risk exposure caused by under and overinsured contracts, we reorganized the process and leveraged expertise. So the risk management team took over the risk identification and transfer process, which allowed buyers to focus on solicitation and negotiation strategies. However, we soon learned this was only the start of our journey. As you'll see in just a moment, we still had some work to do, because although we had the right people taking on the right roles, we had some procedural problems. To give you an idea of how the early process worked, it started with a buyer providing the risk management team with a draft copy of an RFP. The risk management team would identify the risk exposure and prepare a list of insurance requirements based on the level of risk. Risk management would then provide that list to the buyer, who would incorporate it into the RFP. Once the RFP was awarded and a contract was executed, the vendor would send a certificate of insurance to the buyer. The buyer would then send that certificate to the risk management team, who would then determine whether the vendor's certificate met the contract's insurance requirements. If the requirements were met, that's pretty much where the process ended. But if the insurance requirements were not met, the risk management team would let the buyer know, and the buyer would contact the vendor to submit a revised certificate. So clearly, this process was too convoluted and still exposed the state to unnecessary risk, as there was really no continuing verification process to ensure the vendor maintained the required coverage throughout the term of the contract. So for us, it became evident that our pain point was how to effectively and continuously monitor compliance, not only to ensure a vendor certificate contained the required coverage per the contract terms, but also to ensure the required coverage didn't expire or lapse during the term of the contract. So we started doing some research into best practices within the public risk management arena. We also became more active in professional organizations like Strima and Prima. And we found that we really wanted to emulate other state governments' risk management programs who were considered best in class. So we visited 2 states' risk management programs in Georgia and in Washington to really understand how they operated, the structure of their program, and the tools and technology they used. We took all of the information we learned and identified 2 primary issues with our program. We knew that procedurally, we needed a more streamlined workflow, one that involved the risk transfer process being completely within risk management's purview. So setting insurance requirements, receiving and reviewing certificates of insurance, and communicating with vendors directly. And in order to achieve all of that, we needed a software solution that served as a one-stop shop for all things risk management. We wanted a single source for all contract data, specifically a way to keep track of the insurance requirements we developed for each contract, along with the certificates submitted by vendors. We also needed the solution to help with compliance monitoring in a more proactive versus reactive method that would ideally send automated notifications in real time. By pinpointing our primary challenges, identifying our needs, and looking at how other state risk management programs operated, we determined a risk management information system would help us achieve our goal. So we began the RFP process. We started by talking to vendors in the risk management tech space, and we sat through many product demonstrations, which really enlightened us as to what was available in terms of the level of sophistication that some of these products have. And that helped us drill down on selecting a vendor based on best value, and one that really checked all of our boxes. With our RMIS in place, we began the implementation process in early 2022, which involved a lot of manual data entry and working very closely with the vendor's implementation team. But essentially, our implementation process can be broken down into 4 major steps. First, we created a contract. For each contract that was managed by central procurement, we created a record that included basic information like the vendor's company name, the contract number, and the company's point of contact. We then created a risk profile to associate with each contract record. A vendor's risk profile was based on the insurance requirements contained in their contract. Then we uploaded a PDF of the certificate of insurance we had on file for each vendor. And then by doing so, the system automatically indicated the specific areas of non-compliance, if any existed. Now, I should mention that this process involved our system's optical character recognition tool, or OCR, which scans a standard certificate to determine whether it contains the requirements we set up in the risk profile. Our last step of the implementation process involved setting up templates for automated notifications that would be emailed to vendors based on specific triggers. For example, we set up a template for an email to be sent to new vendors upon contract execution, requesting that they submit a certificate of insurance within 10 days that complies with the insurance requirements in their contract. We also set up an email template to notify vendors 7 days prior to one or more required insurance policies' expiration date. Lastly, we have notifications sent when a vendor is non-compliant, sent immediately upon the expiration date of a required insurance policy, and then in 10-day increments thereafter if the vendor is still not compliant. At the 30-day mark, the system notifies the buyer who's responsible for administering the contract, and they communicate with the vendor to ensure a revised certificate of insurance is submitted to bring them into compliance. So just as a reminder, before implementing our risk management information system, the process of identifying and transferring risk was rather complex and reactive. But since we've implemented our risk management information system, the process is much more streamlined and proactive. Buyers collaborate with the risk management team before solicitation. We identify the risk exposure and draft insurance requirements to adequately transfer that risk. And then buyers include the insurance requirements in their RFPs. Once the RFP is awarded and a contract is executed, we create a vendor record and a risk profile in the RMIS. And an email is automatically sent to the vendor requesting a certificate of insurance within 10 days. And from there, the vendor or their insurance agent sends the certificate directly to us, which we upload into the system. And from there, the system really does the compliance monitoring work for us, sending auto-generated emails as needed throughout the contract term. And so here's an example of an auto-generated email. It doesn't have the exact language, but it gives a general idea. As you can see here, the templates have built-in data fields that are auto-populated based on the information we enter into the system. So the fields populate based on the vendor's record, such as the contract number and the vendor's name and business. It also contains built-in data fields that let the vendor know what the specific areas of deficiency found on their certificate of insurance. Given all this functionality, our central procurement team has greatly benefited from our risk management information system. As you've seen, we've vastly improved the process involved with identifying the appropriate insurance requirements for third-party vendors and ensuring compliance throughout the term of the contract. Our compliance rate has increased by over 70% within less than 2 years. And we've also greatly improved our vendor communication and relationships. Of course, with all large-scale projects comes its challenges. We expected our initial communication to all current vendors would present a challenge, informing them of our risk management information system, letting them know they would soon be receiving auto-generated notifications, and requiring electronic submission of certificates of insurance. Some of the unexpected challenges that we've encountered involve the optical character recognition tool, which sometimes misreads characters. But this is mostly the case when the quality of the PDF we upload into the system is very poor. So for example, a $sign on the certificate might be read as a 5 or as an S. And that would sometimes result in a vendor receiving a non-compliant notice, even though they were in fact compliant. But in these types of circumstances, we simply find the error and manually correct it. As far as where we intend to go from here, we're looking to offer our services to other state department purchasing teams to help them achieve the benefits that our central procurement office has realized since we've implemented the RMIS. We're currently working with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, but we're looking forward to working with other departments and agencies in the very near future. We hope our journey will serve as a learning tool for risk management teams across the country so they can collaborate with their procurement departments to efficiently and proactively manage the risks involved with third-party contracts. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions about our presentation.
All right, thank you, Gavin. I appreciate it. We have a few questions here. The first one is, how are risk profiles determined and what factors are used?
So risk profiles essentially is determining what insurance requirements are going to be built into the contract or the RFP rather, once it becomes a contract. And that involves a few different elements. The risk management team reviews the RFP and pays particular attention to the statement of work to understand what the deliverables are and what kind of risk exposure, what kind of risk is exposed to the state. And then we come up with insurance requirements to transfer that risk to the vendor. So for example, most, if not all of our contracts contain a general liability insurance requirement to cover the risks of bodily injury or property damage. We also require typically auto liability insurance if a vehicle is going to be involved in the delivery of contract activities. And then we also, of course, require workers' compensation, employer's liability, so that any injuries that occur to the vendor or their team while performing the activities that are required by the contract are transferred to the vendor in those circumstances as well. So it really all varies. And we have different types of insurance requirements in some of our contracts. So for example, we have pollution liability insurance that we might require in contracts that involve the transport of hazardous material. We may require certain types of aviation insurance if for example, we have a contract with the Department of Natural Resources where they do aerial pesticide sprays on crops. And so in that circumstance, we would require the 4 types of insurance that I mentioned, plus aviation insurance. So it really depends on the types of services that are involved with the contract.
Okay, and then we have another question here. Someone asked if you're able to share the total cost of the project.
So our total contract cost at this point, when we solicited the contract, we did it for a 5-year term with 3 one-year options. And I can grab that for you right now. Well, I'd actually have to do the math on this. I apologize. Let's see, it looks like the total cost of the contract we expected to be around $380,000. And that includes the licenses, the software itself, support hours, and assistance with the implementation process.
Okay, and are you able to share how many FTEs from your office are dedicated to this new solution?
We currently only have, in addition to myself, we have 3.
Okay, great. And then someone asked, what happens if they do not submit insurance certificates within the 10-day period?
So then they would receive one of the non-compliant emails indicating that we don't have a certificate of insurance on file as required by the contract terms.
And you discussed some of the rare system glitches that you encountered. Would you be able to expound on that and just specify a little bit more about what you encountered, some of those rare encounters?
Sure, yeah. So we would sometimes upload a certificate of insurance in a PDF format. And depending on how we receive that PDF, so for example, if a vendor emails a copy of the PDF that they scanned in, that might appear blurry or just somewhat illegible. When we upload it into our system, like I mentioned, sometimes a $ might be misread for a 5 or an S, and that would unfortunately, depending on how it's misread, may notify a vendor that they were not compliant when in fact they actually were. But come to find out, it's only because an insurance requirement of that had a limit of $500,000, for example, might have been translated to a $ followed by 5 zeros.
And you mentioned being able to easily narrow down suppliers to find the right solution. What are the market conditions like for an RMIS? Were there several qualified options that met government standards?
We did have a few vendors that met most of our requirements, but in particular, what we were looking for was that optical character recognition tool, so that the system automatically scanned a certificate of insurance and then fed it into the system to notify the vendor whether or not they were compliant based on that certificate of insurance. And so that really helped us narrow down to one vendor.
Okay, and then before implementing the system, how frequently were insurance certificates re-verified during the contract's lifespan? Was the frequency different dependent on the specific contract?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, no problem. Before implementing the system, how frequently were insurance certificates re-verified during the contract's lifespan? And was the frequency different depending on the specific contract? Did it change from contract to contract?
So the verification process was kind of built in on the purchasing side. So each buyer would have a periodic checkpoint throughout the year. And I can't recall off the top of my head what that frequency or what the cadence was. So just for example, if it was quarterly, they would review their contract to make sure that everything was in line. One of the things that they would check was whether or not the certificate of insurance that was on file was compliant. So whether or not any of the required insurance policies had expired.
Okay, and shifting a little bit, how did you integrate this with your EPRO or ERP system? Was it a challenge?
So it's not currently integrated with our ERP system. As I mentioned during the implementation process, we had a lot of manual entry at the front end. But since then, it's been a rather simplified process of just creating a vendor record and entering the insurance requirements that are required for that particular contract.
Okay, we have another question here. Is AI being used in the optical character recognition tool?
That I don't know specifically. I would imagine there's some sort of AI involved, just given the fact that it has to take a document and compare it to data entries in the system.
Okay, and then just moving a little bit more broadly now, why did you choose to acquire a new RMIS system specifically as opposed to a solution with an existing procurement or a financial system? I guess what went into that decision?
So our current procurement and financial system doesn't allow the capability of, or doesn't have any capability at this point to store certificates of insurance, enter the insurance requirements for each contract, and then doesn't have a scanning tool like the OCR tool that our RMIS has. One thing I didn't mention during our early stages of our risk management process was prior to the risk management information system being implemented, we attempted to track all of the insurance requirements for each contract in an access database, but that didn't really give us a proactive approach to managing contract compliance. We didn't have a method of kind of incorporating like a mail merge, for example, that would be tailored to each vendor, that would pull in the different insurance requirements on a document and send them to the vendor.
Okay, and then a little more specifically about the training piece. What is it exactly? And then how did you go back to training the users?
So I think that question might be regarding the training and consultation that we provide to departments and agencies, and that's separate and apart from what the risk management information system does. Currently, the only users of the RMIS are the enterprise risk management team. So Megan, Deidre, and Brooke, and myself. So there's only the 5 of us, or 4 of us rather, that are users of the system. The training that I referenced earlier in the presentation was in terms of if their purchasing departments needed guidance or training to determine or to help identify the risks that the state would be exposed to in their contracts. Each of the departments under the state of Michigan's executive branch has their own internal purchasing department, whereas we work with the central procurement office that deals with contracts over a certain dollar amount.
Okay, and then about the would the system send and automatic internal notification or to the vendor when the certificates are either close to expire or expired?
Yeah, one of the templates we set up was to kind of give a courtesy notice to the vendors 7 days prior to one of the expiration dates of one or more required policy. And then once it does expire, we have a template that's set up to be sent on the date of the expiration. And then if we don't have compliance from there, every 10 days, they'll receive a non-compliance notice, kind of just giving the benefit of the doubt that Obviously, sometimes it takes some time to maybe work with their insurance broker or their agent to have them send a certificate of insurance, which is why we kind of built in 10-day increments before we notified them again.
Okay, and on the vendor side of things, what has been the feedback from them on this change?
We've gotten generally good feedback. It's like I said, it's kind of created a more streamlined process for us. So there's less confusion on their end in terms of what exactly is deficient or not compliant, because our templates pull in the specific insurance requirements that aren't being met or that they're not compliant with. But as I mentioned early on, we knew one of the challenges would be to notify all of our current vendors and kind of bring them on board in terms of letting them know that this system even existed and that, oh, by the way, you're going to be receiving automated notifications from this system if you're not compliant. So there was a lot of confusion at the front end. Of course, some folks didn't read their emails, and so we got questions about, well, what is this automated notification I received? But over time, and with each vendor that we spoke to and worked with, it's gotten a lot more smooth.
Okay, and heads up, it looks like we're answering some questions live in the Q&A box, but I also wanted to read them aloud just so that for those who are listening in or watching the recording so that they can maybe have access to those answers as well. One of the questions is, does this system only manage statewide contracts and those under the Central Procurement Office, or does it also monitor agency or department-specific contracts? And are there any plans for expansion?
Yeah, so right now we're only a couple years into utilizing the risk management information system, and we're piloting expanding our services with the Department of Health and Human Services. So we're starting to establish insurance requirements and monitor compliance with their contracts, and then we're going to kind of gauge how this pilot program goes with the Department of Health and Human Services before we roll out to other agencies and departments. But currently, it's only with the Central Procurement Office.
Okay, and about how many contracts would you say go through RMIS every year?
On average, we estimate about 700 to 800 a year in central procurement alone.
Okay, and then kind of a broader kind of perspective-based question. Overall, how has this changed the contract management process? Have you had any feedback from the contract management side of things?
Yeah, I think it's really worked out well for them because we've essentially absolved them from any responsibility in not only determining the appropriate insurance requirements for their contract, but then also following up on compliance. So we've taken a huge responsibility off of the buyers and the purchasing side of things.
Okay, and you mentioned the 70% compliance rate during the presentation. Can you just expound a little bit about how that's improved the process for all involved?
Sure, yeah. So when we started this, we estimated that we had about, I mean, it's horrible to say, less than 10% compliance. But by virtue of communications being automated and specifying exactly where there are areas of non-compliance or deficiency in a certificate of insurance, it's greatly improved the speed at which we can bring contractors into compliance, because it's really just a matter of vendors reading the email they receive, understanding where they're deficient or non-compliant, and then sending us a revised certificate, which again, kind of we just upload into the system, and it kind of goes from there. And so over time, by the reporting functions that the system has, or rather, we have seen a significant increase. We're currently standing, I think, at close to 80% compliance. And I think we just kind of have an understanding that there's going to be a certain margin where we just don't have responsive contractors, or for one reason or another, the emails or notifications that are being generated and sent are possibly going to the wrong individual in the business, or maybe even getting bounced back as spam. But we're working with those specific contractors that are continually non-compliant with our purchasing staff to make sure that they're brought into compliance.
Okay, so I'll close out the Q&A portion here with just one more question. Can you speak about how the insurance requirements are determined per contract or RFP and how that process works?
Sure, yeah. So like I mentioned, our team receives an RFP, and we focus really in on the statement of work and determine what the risk exposure is to the state. And then we select the types of insurance and specific limits based on that risk exposure. So again, for example, if we have a contract that involves aerial pesticide application, we might require aviation insurance. If a particular contract involves the use of a vehicle to carry out the contract activities, we would require auto liability insurance. But most, if not all, of our contracts require general liability insurance and workers' compensation to just make sure that that risk is transferred to the vendor.
Okay, then that will conclude today's presentation, and I want to thank our presenter Gavin and the folks in the office there for the valuable information that you've all shared today, and for working with us here at NASPO to bring it to you. Thank you all for attending this webinar today, and you will all receive a follow-up email containing today's slides and materials. Remember, this webinar qualifies as 1 contact hour for your continuing education credits. To receive your certificate, simply fill out the survey in your browser window once you've exited the webinar. The webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page in the coming days. Questions entered into the chat and Q&A boxes have been saved, and we will try to follow up via email for any ones not addressed during the presentation. Don't forget to check out the upcoming webinars and other events at naspo.org. Join us for the next webinar in the Cronin webinar series on Wednesday, February 26th, next Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. The webinar is titled Considering Carbon and Climate: Striving for a Sustainable Supply Chain. It will be an opportunity to learn about Massachusetts' new Climate and Sustainability Unit within its State Procurement Office. Thanks again to our wonderful presenters, and thank you to our guests. Have a great day.